The 7 levels of superhero movies explained.
Level 1.
Snapped tier logic. In human terms, this is where the suit doesn't work, the tone doesn't work, the plot doesn't work, and somehow, the marketing budget was still bigger than some countries' GDP. Morbius. The film where a man becomes a vampire bat superhero adjacent thing, and the internet decided, with more conviction than the actual screenwriters showed, that its Morbin time was funnier than anything in the movie itself. This is a film where the villain's motivation is essentially, I also want to be a vampire bat, please, delivered with the emotional urgency of someone asking for extra guac. The action sequences are shot in a blur, so aggressive it's basically a Rorschach test. Tell me what you see, because nobody in the editing bay could. Fant-4-stick, spelled with a 4, because apparently someone decided numerals fix tone problems the way duct tape fixes a sinking ship. It starts as a grounded, moody sci-fi body horror film about 4 scientists teleporting into a nightmare dimension, and ends as a generic CGI laser fight against a floating purple guy, like watching 2 entirely different movies fist fight for control of the same runtime. The reshoots are so visible, you could timestamp them, and the tonal whiplash is severe enough that you leave the theater slightly concussed, unsure if you just watched a superhero film or an early 2000s art house project that lost a bet. Steel, starring peak-era Shaquille O'Neal, in a suit reportedly so heavy he could barely lift his arms above his head, which, for a superhero whose entire job is punching things, is a genuinely inconvenient design flaw. It's the cinematic equivalent of hiring an Olympic sprinter and then handcuffing his ankles together. The talent is there, the execution actively works against it. Shaq himself has been refreshingly honest about this one over the years, which is more self-awareness than most of the films on this list ever managed to muster about themselves. Catwoman, not bad Catwoman. Catwoman as a taxonomy-breaking event, a film so disconnected from its source material, it should be studied by anthropologists rather than critics. Halle Berry, an actual Oscar winner, plays a woman resurrected by cats, actual cats, breathing on her, who gains the superpower of being sassy and eating sushi off a man's bare chest, in a scene that exists for reasons modern science still cannot fully explain. It's not that the film misunderstands Catwoman, it's that it seems to have never met her, read about her, or so much as Googled her before cameras rolled. The Spirit, a movie so drenched in high contrast, comic panel style, it forgot to smuggle in an actual plot, like ordering a 5-course tasting menu and receiving 5 plates of garnish and nothing else. Every frame looks like a poster. None of the frames add up to a story you could explain to a friend without your voice trailing off halfway through. Samuel L. Jackson spends a portion of this film in a Nazi uniform for reasons the script never bothers to justify, and if that sentence alone doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the quality control on this production, I genuinely don't know what will.
Level 2.
Chaotic. Tier logic. These are projects that took a real creative swing, missed spectacularly, and somehow made it charming instead of career-ending. It's the difference between tripping on the sidewalk and tripping into a full backflip that somehow sticks the landing on style points alone. This is genuinely my favorite tier to talk about, because unlike level 1, nobody here is embarrassed. They knew exactly what they were building. They just built it with the structural integrity of a Jenga tower after 3 rounds. Batman and Robin, bat nipples, ice puns delivered with the conviction of a Shakespearean monologue. A film so fully committed to camp it should be studied in drama school under the heading Full Send. Every single actor in this movie appears to be performing in a completely different genre. Arnold Schwarzenegger is doing dad joke stand-up. George Clooney is doing a Batman audition tape for a movie that doesn't exist. And somehow, 30 years later, we're still talking about it, which is more than you can say for most competently made films from the same decade. Batman v Superman, the theatrical cut, where 2 of the biggest icons in fiction fight because their mothers share the same first name, and somehow that's not even the strangest justification for conflict in the entire DC lineup. This is a movie with genuinely ambitious ideas. Bruce Wayne as a broken, paranoid man, radicalized by decades of watching Gotham rot, buried under editing so aggressive it feels like the studio hired someone to remove every scene that explained anything, then charged you full price for the confusion. Green Lantern, a movie that put Ryan Reynolds in a CGI suit so uncanny it looks like his own skin filed a restraining order against the fabric. The cosmic scope is genuinely ambitious, an entire intergalactic police force powered powered by willpower is a wild swing for a 2011 blockbuster, but the visual effects technology of the era simply couldn't cash the check the script was writing, and the result looks like a screensaver cosplaying as a movie. Ryan Reynolds himself has since built an entire second career out of joking about this film, which is either the healthiest possible response to a career flop or the world's longest exposure therapy session. Venom, where Tom Hardy has full, unhinged conversations with a voice in his own head about eating tater tots and biting off people's faces, delivered with the emotional commitment of a man losing an argument with his own digestive system. This was supposed to be a grim, R-rated symbiote horror film, and instead, it accidentally became one of the funniest buddy comedies of the decade. Nobody involved seemed to agree on what kind of movie they were making, and the disagreement is the entire joy of watching it. Suicide Squad, 2016, edited like it was assembled by someone speedrunning a trailer competition with a gun to their head, structurally incoherent in ways that make the plot nearly impossible to summarize sober. And yet the soundtrack is so stacked. Queen, Eminem, Kanye, it's basically a Spotify playlist wearing a movie as a costume. And the cast chemistry, especially Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn, is good enough that you can feel the better film trying to claw its way out from underneath the studio notes.
Level 3.
Corporate tier logic, competently made, expensively funded, star-studded, and vanishing from public memory approximately 11 minutes after the credits roll. Thor, Love and Thunder, a film with Christian Bale playing a genuinely terrifying, grief-stricken villain, wasted on a plot that remembers to include jokes roughly every 90 seconds and forgets to include stakes for most of its runtime. Somewhere in this movie is a real meditation on faith, loss, and screaming gods, and somewhere else in this movie is a running gag about talking goats, and the two never quite agree to share the same film. Black Widow, a perfectly competent spy thriller that arrived roughly 6 years after the last person on Earth was still asking, wait, what exactly is Black Widow's backstory? It's well shot, well acted, has a genuinely fun family dynamic with Florence Pugh, and still manages to feel like reading yesterday's newspaper. Good reporting, terrible timing. Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, technically the most expensive-looking movie ever made, about a guy who shrinks, featuring Jonathan Majors, giving an unsettlingly good performance as Kang. All of it wrapped inside a microverse adventure, so visually cluttered, it feels like watching someone else play a mid-tier video game, on mute, at a party you didn't want to attend. The budget reportedly cracked $200 million, and the film still manages to feel like pure connective tissue. Shazam! Fury of the Gods, a sequel so polished, so competently assembled, and so instantly forgettable, it should arrive with a mandatory NDA, preventing you from remembering plot details past the parking lot. The cast is charming, the mid-credits gag is fine, the villains are played by genuinely good actors doing genuinely fine work. Nobody, 6 months later, could tell you a single thing that happened in it, and I say that as someone who watched it specifically to write this section and had to check my notes twice, and I'm still not entirely confident I got it right. The Amazing Spider-Man 2, a film that tried to set up 4 different villains and at least 3 different spin-off franchises in a single 2-hour movie, like ordering the entire restaurant menu because you genuinely couldn't decide on an appetizer. Somewhere in the wreckage is a genuinely good Peter and Gwen relationship, buried under a Green Goblin subplot, rushing so hard toward a cinematic universe that never happened that the movie forgets to be its own story. And before we move on, it would be a dream if you could help this channel reach 500,000 subscribers, and it's completely free.
Level 4.
Wasted tier logic. Genuinely good projects, sometimes great ones, sabotaged by exactly one identifiable flaw, like a 5-star meal with a single hair in it. Daredevil on Netflix, where seasons 1 and 3 are some of the best superhero television ever produced. Grounded, brutal, Catholic guilt-soaked storytelling, anchored by a hallway fight scene in season 1, still referenced as a stunt choreography benchmark. And then season 2 remembers that Elektra and the Hand exist, tries to cram an entire ninja cult apocalypse next to Frank Castle's one-man war on crime, and the show faceplants for 8 episodes, trying to serve 2 mythologies that were never built to share a season. The Boys, a show that started as the sharpest satire on television, gleefully skewering corporate superhero culture with real teeth, and has increasingly leaned on shock value, the way a stand-up comedian leans on the mic stand when the actual jokes run dry. The political commentary is still sharp sharp in flashes, but the ratio of genuine insight to gratuitous carnage has been sliding in a direction the early seasons never needed, like a chef who used to season food and now just sets the plate on fire and calls it flavor. X-Men, Days of Future Past, an almost flawless time travel structure, weaving together two separate cast generations with more discipline than most franchises manage across a single film, undercut by an ending that resets the stakes so cleanly it retroactively erases the consequences of nearly every prior film in the series. It's a movie that solves everything a little too neatly, like finishing a jigsaw puzzle and realizing the box came with a cheat sheet. Impressive craftsmanship, slightly hollow victory. Logan, a near-perfect, elegiac send-off for a character who'd been running for 17 years, held back by a final act villain, a clone antagonist, so thin and underdeveloped, he might as well have been CGI'd in from a completely different, much worse movie. Everything else in this film is a masterclass in restraint. The quiet, the road trip pacing, the genuinely devastating final 10 minutes. That one choice isn't restrained at all. It's the equivalent of a beautifully plated meal with a plastic fork stabbed into the middle of it. Watchmen, the 2009 film, gorgeously faithful to Alan Moore's panels, shot for shot, in a way that borders on religious devotion, right up until the ending swaps out the source material's actual moral thesis, humanity uniting against a fabricated common enemy, for a simpler, punchier alternative that misreads exactly what the book was trying to say.
Level 5.
Almost tier logic. Great, sometimes borderline flawless, missing exactly one component that keeps it from full immortality, a sequel that never happened, a format limitation, a mainstream breakthrough that just never fully landed. Spider-Man 2, from 2004, still one of the most emotionally rich superhero films ever made. And here's the sincere part. This is a movie that understands, better than almost any film in the genre before or since, that the mask is the least interesting part of the story. Peter Parker losing his powers isn't a plot device, it's a breakdown, filmed with the same emotional honesty you'd give a divorce drama, right down to the framing of his empty apartment and the takeout containers piling up like evidence. The train sequence, where exhausted strangers catch an unconscious, unmasked Spider-Man and pass him overhead like he's one of their own, remains one of the most quietly moving images the genre has ever produced. Batman Begins, an excellent, disciplined foundation that treats Bruce Wayne's origin with the seriousness of an actual character study rather than an obligatory prologue, missing only the towering, unforgettable iconography that its own sequel would go on to supply 2 years later. It's the best table setting a franchise has ever done. It just isn't on its own the main course, and there's no shame in being the appetizer when the appetizer is this good. Watchmen, the HBO series from 2019, a genuinely brilliant expansion of the source material that takes Alan Moore's themes about power, legacy, and masked vigilantism and applies them directly to American racial history with real courage. It's missing only the mainstream cultural saturation that a 9-episode limited series was never structurally built to achieve. Brilliant work, seen by fewer people than it deserved, which is arguably the most superhero-adjacent tragedy on this entire list. Deadpool, from 2016, a genre-redefining, fourth-wall-shattering swing that proved an R-rated, self-aware superhero film could be both a critical success and a box office phenomenon. What it's missing is the sprawling, multi-film mythological weight that bigger franchises accumulate over a decade of interconnected storytelling. Deadpool is a brilliant single joke, landing perfectly. It just isn't, yet, an entire saga, though give it time, because this franchise has been remarkably good at not letting a little thing like continuity get in its way. Man of Steel, visually and thematically ambitious in ways that genuinely reframe what a Superman film could look like, missing the tonal warmth that might have made audiences love it instead of spend a decade arguing about it. It's a film more interested in the weight of godhood than the joy of it, and that choice is exactly why people still can't agree on it. The kind of movie that starts fights at dinner parties roughly a decade after it came out, which is either a failure or the highest form of success, depending entirely on who's arguing.
Level 6.
Borderline tier logic. Elite, top shelf, held back by one small, specific technicality. A shaky final act, one narrow logic gap, something so minor it only bothers the purists, but purists never, ever shut up about it. The Dark Knight Rises, closing an elite trilogy with real ambition, an entire city held hostage, a villain built like a physical force of nature, held back by plot logic gaps that keep gnawing at you on rewatch, like the pit escape or the multi-city timeline that only works if Gotham has secretly abolished travel time altogether. It's a satisfying ending that doesn't fully survive close inspection, and close inspection is exactly what this fanbase specializes in, myself very much included. Avengers, Infinity War, a massive execution success and one of the most audacious blockbuster structures ever attempted, juggling roughly 24 major characters across 6 planets and somehow giving nearly every single one of them a real emotional beat. From Thor's grief to Gamora's sacrifice to Peter Parker's devastating final scene. The Russo brothers pull off a genuine structural miracle here, coordinating a cast list longer than most graduating classes without a single storyline feeling shortchanged. Logan, viewed through a different lens this time, genre redefining, devastating, one of the few superhero films that earned comparisons to actual westerns, complete with a literal screening of Shane playing in the background as thematic commentary. But its unrelenting bleakness limits its rewatch immortality compared to the pure, unimpeachable joy of what's waiting in Level 7. You respect it enormously. Joker, from 2019, a genuinely brilliant character study wrapped in a comic book universe it barely acknowledges, anchored by a performance from Joaquin Phoenix that swept awards season and had him losing a genuinely alarming amount of weight for the role. It's kept borderline by the eternal, exhausting debate over whether it's even a superhero film at all.
Level 7.
Untouchable tier logic, and this one isn't a joke. Zero legitimate counter-argument. The Dark Knight, 2008, still cited as the genre's ceiling, still quoted by people who've never read a single comic book in their life, permanently embedded in film discourse that has nothing to do with superheroes at all. This isn't really a superhero film anymore. It's a crime epic that happens to feature a man in a cape, and Heath Ledger's Joker doesn't just steal scenes, he redefines what a comic book villain is allowed to be on screen. Layered with a moral philosophy, the film never lets you dismiss as simple chaos. Every performance, every set piece, every line of dialogue is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, with nothing wasted, right down to the interrogation room scene that's been dissected in film classes with the same rigor usually reserved for actual literature. Superman, 1978, the film that essentially invented the entire genre's DNA. The earnestness, the soaring John Williams score, the sense of a god who chose kindness, and remains unchallenged as the template every origin story since has been quietly copying, whether they admit it or not. This film earns its spot not through darkness, but through the audacity of pure, unashamed sincerity, convincing an entire audience that a man could fly, and that believing it wouldn't be embarrassing. That's a much harder trick than making something dark and cool. The Avengers, 2012, the film that proved a shared cinematic universe could actually work at scale, a structural and tonal template every studio in Hollywood has spent the last decade trying, and mostly failing, to replicate. It juggles 6 major heroes, gives every one of them a defining moment, and somehow still finds room for genuine wit. The shawarma scene alone is a masterclass in knowing exactly when to let a movie exhale after 2 hours of stakes, a tiny, human beat that somehow became just as iconic as the battle that preceded it. Spider-Man: No Way Home, 2021, a genuine cultural event in an era when very few films managed to be one. A movie where critics, casual audiences, and lifelong comic readers all landed in the same emotional place at the same time, watching 3 generations of a single character finally share the same screen. It's the rare fan service film that earns every tear it extracts, because it understands the difference between a cameo and a payoff 20 years in the making. The "Hey Peter" moment alone has been dissected, gifted, and cried over enough times to qualify as its own cultural institution.